Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the Federal Working Group on Coal Communities. I'm Robert Kell. I'm the New Economy Program Manager at Appalachian Voices, and I will be joined by Chelsea Barnes, the Legislative Director at Appalachian Voices. And we are excited to share more about the Coal Communities Working Group and ways for folks to get involved. Chelsea, feel free to go to the next slide. So what is the Interagency Working Group? Shortly after taking office in January, President Biden, through an executive order on climate change, established the Interagency Working Group on Coal Communities, also known as the Coal Communities Working Group. This group of cabinet secretaries and other federal officials is charged with crafting policy and delivering resources to revitalize the economy and communities that have recently lost jobs as a result of the country's move away from coal and other fossil fuels. This working group is housed in the Department of Energy and is administered by the Secretary of Energy. But it's co-chaired by the National Climate Advisor and the Director of National Economic Council. The guiding principles for the working group are to create good paying jobs, provide federal investments to catalyze revitalization, support energy workers by securing benefits and providing opportunity, prioritize pollution mitigation and remediation, adopt a government-wide approach, and formalize stakeholder engagement efforts. Chelsea, you can go to the next slide.
All right, so thanks everyone for joining today. So, that list of agencies and really important people sounds pretty intimidating to a lot of us folks, but as we've been working to engage more with the Coal Communities Working Group, we've been getting to know the staff, and so wanted to kind of give folks the lay of the land of who's actually doing the work on the ground. Most of these cabinet secretaries are not implementing the day-to-day work of the Interagency Working Group. They've got other pretty important stuff to do. So a lot of the work of the working group falls to staff within the National Energy Technology Lab. So they are based in West Virginia. That's where most of the lab staff are physically located. The executive director of the Interagency Working Group is Brian Anderson, who some of you folks, if you've worked in West Virginia, might know from his work at Nettle. In addition to Brian, there's a deputy executive director of the Interagency Working Group, Briggs White. And then underneath Briggs, there's at least 15 staff people at Nettle who are working on the Interagency Working Group. So there's a lot of staff time being dedicated to this effort. In addition, we're working closely with Kate Gordon of the Department of Energy. She is new to the Department of Energy. She's a senior advisor. She comes from California, where she worked on just transition efforts out in California. And I'll just pause there to say that Briggs and Kate are the folks that are kind of leading the stakeholder engagement aspect of this work. So any of the direct outreach we've been doing with the Interagency Working Group has been with Briggs and Kate, and they're very responsive. Beyond them, there is also Jahi Wise, who's a senior advisor in the White House on climate policy and finance, Nellie Abernathy, who's within the Department of Commerce, Brent Parton is with the Department of Labor, and each of the federal agencies that is tapped to work on the working group has a staff level person who is kind of charged with being that agency's point person on the Interagency Working Group. But these are the folks who we've been mostly involved with. So if there's anyone at a specific agency and you're wondering, who's the point person at the Department of Interior, we could work with Kate and Briggs to figure out who that right point person would be. So these folks are all working collaboratively on the Interagency Working Group. Brian Anderson is the executive director, and I know there's been some concern with his past work on on things like plastics and natural gas and other um, fossil fuel technologies. What I'll say is that he is very committed to stakeholder engagement and making sure that um, folks in coal impacted communities are part of this process. So I think it's someone that we can work with him on that aspect of things, but knowing that we're going to butt heads with him on certain things, especially as they relate to the environment, climate change, and worker protections, I think, you know, I would encourage folks to keep in mind that he's not the sole decision maker here, that there is a big team effort driving the work of the interagency working group. And Brian Anderson, yes, has a leadership role, but is just one person. And I think we have a lot of allies in some of the other folks listed here, and probably a lot of the staff at Nettle who share our priorities for helping coal communities. So I'm gonna stop there and move on to the next slide.
Thanks, Chelsea. For folks who are joining us a little late, we do plan on sharing this webinar and the slides with everybody. We're recording, so it'll be a resource that's available. But just to sort of recap again, the Interagency Working Group on Coal Communities was established through an executive order in January signed by President Biden. And it's housed, the working group itself is made up of 11 different agencies and cabinet secretaries, and it's housed in the Department of Energy. And Chelsea just reviewed our key contacts and those folks who are doing the direct engagement with communities. A part of the executive order, in addition to creating the IWG, mandated an initial report to happen within 60 days. And that report identified mechanisms that would prioritize grant making, federal loan programs, technical assistance, financing, procurement, and other existing programs to support the revitalization of the economies of coal and power plant communities. So the initial recommendations on supporting workers and fossil fuel communities, creating good union paying jobs, and catalyzing the economic revitalization. The report acknowledged current challenges are a result of years of divestment, and it identified about 38 billion in existing federal funding that could be accessible to energy communities. And technically that money is already available. The report identified a set of 25 communities across the country that were hard hit by coal mine and coal power plant closures, and that should be prioritized for focused federal investment. They aren't limiting themselves to just these 25 communities. In addition, they've identified a broader set of energy impacted communities for the working group to focus on to address the long-term declines anticipated from the clean energy transition. Within the report, they have identified fence line communities and tribal communities that are also important. Even the most recent funding announcement is not limited to these 25 communities, but the funding is open for any community that has experienced a negative economic impact from coal. And we are we've been encouraged by both Briggs and Kate that if there are communities that aren't on their radar or they are part of these fence line communities, and they should be brought into the stakeholder process in a more meaningful way, that we should send that information to them. They are very willing to hear from us. A part of the report proposes a one-stop shop to access federal investments. Within 1 year, they're supposed to establish this one-stop shop for energy communities seeking access to federal resources and identify mechanisms to coordinate the activities of federal agencies and the delivery of federal resources to reinforce the economic revitalization goals of the working group. Kate Gordon is working on a memo concerning the integration of these resources and funding opportunities. And I think that might be available for community engagement stakeholders soon, but they have until around April to figure out this one-stop shop. In addition, they are considering the formation of an energy community advisory group that would be made up of key constituencies, community groups, state, local, tribal officials, environmental justice organizations, labor unions. They are in the process of what that formalization would look like and are very interested in hearing from communities concerning best practices. Chelsea, you can go to the next slide. So here's a list of those 25 communities. We can expect some type of engagement in each of these communities starting in September and going through next spring. They are hopeful that senior administration will visit with them in these communities to engage with community members. They're still interested in figuring out what each of these events would look like. Will they be roundtable discussions? Will they be community tours, town halls, workshops? COVID is changing this a little bit. So we've seen them already move some of their technical workshops to virtual formats. And our guess is that more and more of these community engagements will also be COVID, have some type of COVID protocol and might be virtually. Although there's a lot of uncertainty still around the format of these engagement opportunities, again, they are very open to hearing from us and what would be best and how to make those like really worthwhile and have deep engagement. Chelsea, you can go to the next slide. So here's some near-term events that we know are coming up. This Thursday, they're going to have their Coal Communities Commitment webinar, which is really going to be diving into the Economic Development Administration's announcement of a $300 million funding opportunity to support economic work in hard-hit coal and energy communities. We'll share the registration with you all, but again, that's coming up this Thursday. And then the two events that they were planning on having in person, which have now been moved online, are regionally focused virtual workshops to meet directly with an opportunity for folks to meet directly with federal agencies and for local practitioners to learn about the available resources and to discuss potential projects for regional economic work. Again, that's directly tied with that EDA funding announcement. They also have some additional regional workshops, one in Colorado, Arizona, and North Dakota. We've included what information we have on those right now. It seems as of last Thursday that some of those are still in person, but starting in September, they do hope to begin their in-person stakeholder engagements, and they're going to start in May 1, West Virginia, and then continue to work with community stakeholders going forward about the other 25 priority, the other 24 priority communities. Chelsea, you can go to the next slide. So some near-term events, again, the working group intends to do more in-person stakeholder engagement as possible. If you want an in-person stakeholder engagement in your community, you should really reach out to them or really coordinate with us on how to help make that happen. Before stakeholder engagement meetings, they intend to do pre-meetings for logistical support to think about like time, place, format, and again, more technical workshops in the future. They are prioritizing the EDA $300 million funding because those phase 1 applications are due in October, and they really want to make sure like that funding is reaching the communities. Again, here's a registration link, and we will be sharing that out after this webinar to ensure that everyone can sign up for this Thursday's webinar. We can go to the next slide.
Alrighty. And I'll just add, before I dive into this, that website on the previous page here, energycommunities.nettle.doe.gov, has a lot of other information about the funding opportunities, events, registrations for all the events. There's a way to sign up on that website for emails from the working group. So might want to take note of that. We'll share it again at the end, but so, I think one of the things that we wanted to kind of pause and address is that there's a lot of skepticism about this process, this interagency working group that's been set up. Coal impacted communities in Appalachia, particularly, have long kind of had these promises from lawmakers, from administration officials, from presidents, from candidates for president, whatever, that they're going to help coal impacted communities. And we don't see that materialize. So I know a lot of folks are really skeptical that this process is worth engaging in, that it's worth going to the events. And I hear that, I get it. And there's a part of me that shares that skepticism. But we did want to kind of talk about, why Appalachian Voices is trying to engage in this process, and why you might also consider doing so and getting your members or your communities to engage as well. We've already seen that this process, this interagency working group, has made a commitment. They have carved out this $300 million of an initial funding opportunity that's going to be directed at coal communities. And so that's in itself a kind of a big deal, that there is this carve out of a huge funding opportunity that is directed at coal impacted communities. So we think that's a really good sign that they are taking this seriously, that the commitment is there. The interagency working group as a whole, they're kind of dividing their work up into 3 buckets. The first area is policy. So, you've got people involved in the interagency working group that are staff at federal agencies, that are policy advisors at these federal agencies, that are sharing what they hear from our communities with the cabinet officials, and that filters up to the president, that filters up to decision makers, that filters up to the people who are writing the rules at these federal agencies. So to the extent that you have policy changes that you really want to see that specifically impact coal impacted communities, this is a really good way to engage and try to get cabinet level officials to care about your policy issues. So that can be through talking to them directly, organizing stakeholder meetings with these folks that really do want to listen, and also showing up to events and making sure that our stories are being told at these events. So one of the main reasons, or I guess I'm kind of hitting on two of the main reasons here that we think it's important to get involved with this is, number one, to influence the conversation, and number two, to influence policy. If we don't show up to these meetings, these events, and communicate directly with the interagency working group staff, they're not going to hear from the people who care about our issues. They're going to continue to hear from, the people in power, or the people who, the fossil fuel industry. They're going to hear from the people who show up, and that's going to influence both the policy direction, and it's also going to influence the media conversation. To the extent that these events are public, there will be press, there will be media coverage, so the way that this is covered in the press, I think, is also really important to our goals long term, and making sure that the voices in impacted communities are heard. Another reason to get involved is to influence how money is spent. So the second area of work for the interagency working group is how to better spend money and deploy resources in disadvantaged communities. So in conversations that I've had with some of the folks involved in the interagency working group, they express frustration about how there are way too many different broadband funding buckets of federal funding, that there needs to be better integration of how broadband is funded, how broadband expansion is funded, and how to access that money. So they see some of the same problems that we see on the ground when we're trying to access federal resources to help communities um, either revitalize or transition. And so they are actively seeking advice on how to do this better, how to spend federal money better than how it's been spent in the past. And that's where that one-stop shop idea kind of came up, is that every community would have a place that they could go, a specific point of contact that would help them access federal resources. That could be helping write grant applications. It could be helping to identify appropriate federal grant opportunities, or helping with technical assistance, things like that. So that they're still seeking input and will be seeking input for a while on how those one-stop shops should be set up. So if your members, your partners have tried to work with federal grants and had frustrations, or you haven't ever tried because it's too hard and too frustrating, that's an area where you could really impact how they change how money is spent in disadvantaged communities. And I think that's an area where a lot of folks that I've seen on this call would have some really good advice for our federal agencies. And then lastly is influencing how this administration engages with stakeholders in coal impacted communities long term. So they are, kind of scrambling, I would say, to set up these stakeholder engagement processes now. They're doing these workshops focused around the EDA funding currently, but beyond that, I think how they engage with communities long term is really up in the air. So as Robert mentioned, if you think that there is a community that they really need to visit and listen to, we would really encourage you to reach out to the working group and talk to them about how they can best do that. And if that sounds intimidating to you or like way too much work, we are more than happy to help you, put you in touch with them, support you in whatever way makes sense. Other ideas that have come up are things like topic area workshops. So like bringing in experts or impacted communities around a specific issue like coal ash or power plant closure, something like that, where, maybe there are a lot of different communities experiencing the same thing, and maybe is better to bring people together around a specific issue rather than around a specific community. So if that's something that you think this process would really benefit from, we encourage you to reach out to the IWG or to us and we can help kind of bring that idea to them. They are considering setting up a more formalized stakeholder advisory committee. That is a formal federal thing that makes the process much more formal, with really hard deadlines on community comment opportunities, things like that. But if you have thoughts on how something like that should be designed or how they should be doing this kind of near term stakeholder engagement, that's another thing that we have the opportunity to influence. I'm going to go on to the next slide, Robert.
Thanks, Chelsea. We're getting a lot of questions as well, and we'll have some time shortly to be able to dive into some of those if they're not getting answered in the chat. So how to get involved? Please stay tuned, at least with us, and we hope to continue to share information as it comes in. We've created a web page on our website that I'll share out later that will have announcements and ways to get involved And hopefully we'll have an action portal and a video up there soon so that we can share with our networks to begin to collect some comments, because we imagine that there will be a public comment period coming up soon. Continue to share with your network. You can share the resources that we're sharing with you today, and any of the resources that are actually coming from the IWG as well. Always feel free to reach out to Kate and Briggs, or and they're very willing to answer questions and help and take feedback about the process as well. You can go to the next slide. We are gonna, by just attending today, you've sort of signed up to receive some updates and resources. But if you know other folks that should be a part of receiving those from us, happy to add those names to the list. But you should also sign up for updates and resources from the IWG. And again, I've seen that link in the chat, but I'll share it again later today. We really are advertising this Coal Communities Commitment webinar on Thursday. They're going to dive into the EDA funding, that $300 million, how it came to be, what it should be used for, and how to best begin to apply for that funding. Chelsea and I are always available as well. Our contact is here. And again, I'll be sharing that later today, a follow-up email. We're still learning, at least I'm still learning. I'm leaning a lot on Chelsea. I'm learning a lot from her, but learning a lot from folks who have been participating in these conversations. And I think as time goes on, we'll all have a better grasp of what the IWG is really hoping to achieve. I think the next slide, Chelsea. Yeah, so we'll field questions. And I think, Chelsea, if you want to come off of mute, I'll lean into your expertise here.
Sure. Cannot access the Q&A for some reason. When I click on it, nothing happens. So if we want to start with the questions from the Q&A, if someone could read them to me, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I can start. Is there anything planned in Wyoming?
So I know that they were talking about going out there, and then I also heard that Wyoming, that there were stakeholders in Wyoming that were encouraging the IWG to not come out there, that they would not be received well. So there's nothing currently planned, but I think that doesn't mean that there will never be anything planned. I think if you're somebody who works in Wyoming and you want to see something planned there, I think that it would be good to reach out to them and talk to them about how to do that, because I know that there were some concerns around how it would be received, and that's probably going to be an issue in a lot of communities. And we've encouraged them that if they do plan to visit, that they need to do some groundwork first, that they need to make connections in the community so that they are received well, that it doesn't just look like some fly-in photo op for the administration to pat themselves on the back and say they went to coal country. So it's true for a lot of communities, I think.
Yeah, and then in the chat there was a question about Ohio as well, and I think Ohio is a part of their larger Appalachia territory that they're trying to cover.
Yeah, so it looks like they, if I can't, it's hard to tell. It looks like on the map that there is some green in there that, oh, look at that, Wheeling, West Virginia, Ohio, number 3. So I imagine they'll be up in that area at some point. But again, if there's a need for something outside of that, that identified area, definitely reach out to them. And yeah, we haven't heard of any events in Ohio.
Yeah, and we're going to share the report later that also really does highlight the fence line communities. And so if you are looking at this map and you see, it's not one of the 25 priority communities or even the next sort of layer of priority communities, they're still very open to hearing from these other impacted communities. The next question, do we expect or are you hearing that industry is going to show up in a large numbers or just their industry leaders?
I haven't heard that specifically, but I just can't imagine that if there were some sort of um, event like this, that you wouldn't see um, a lot of heavy influence from industry. Um, I think it's probably going to vary on the community in terms of like what kind of industry is still left there um, for anyone to show up. But I think we have to assume that there will be people who want to see more coal mining or more coal power plants. I think that you have to expect that they're going to show up.
Chelsea, earlier you mentioned that there are 3 areas of focus for the IWG: policy, how to better spend money / resources, and there was another one that folks didn't catch.
Stakeholder engagement, long-term stakeholder engagement.
Thank you. And then there's a question about East Tennessee, and I think that probably goes along with the Ohio question of looking at the map. It's not highlighted, but again, I in a recent conversation, Tennessee came up, and I think I remember Briggs saying like they're open to hearing from folks in Tennessee. So those are all the questions in the queue. Oh no, there's not. Sorry, I forgot to scroll. Here we go. How does Tennessee and TVA areas become priority communities? We have a number of plant closures coming up and mountains of coal ash sitting in groundwater, health, labor, environment, all are areas where we need help.
Yeah, so let me just talk about how they identified these 25 communities. Basically, what they did is they took the metropolitan or non-metropolitan areas that are identified by the Department of Labor. So it's like a preset geographic area that Department of Labor uses for all sorts of data. So they took those areas and compared the number of coal jobs currently. So coal plants or coal mining currently, and compared it to the existing jobs in that area. So what percentage of jobs in that area are coal jobs right now? So it doesn't look backwards at all. So communities that have been experiencing long-term loss are, not included if they don't also still have a lot of coal jobs. And it, how how that percentage number comes out and whether you made the top 25 is dependent on how many other kinds of jobs are in that metropolitan area. It definitely does not make sense. It was definitely like not the way that they should do this, but they have stressed to us over and over again that they are not using this as like the bottom line. This is the only thing we're going to consider. So I know it makes it harder for some communities to like feel like they're being heard because they weren't identified in this top 25. But they've also heard loud and clear that they by using this methodology that they have missed a lot of communities. So all I can say is like shout really loud and be really noisy, and we'll help you be noisy if you want your community, in Ohio, in Tennessee, and other places, like if it's really important to you all that there be listening sessions, we'll help you be loud about it.
Chelsea, there's a concern that this money and the funding will go to businesses that ultimately benefit the owners and not the community. And another example of like what this person is concerned about is like ATV parks that might degrade the mountains. Any insight or comfort around the funding?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's gonna, Robert mentioned that there is $38 billion identified in the report that's already available. And so that funding is like existing federal programs that aren't targeted at coal communities, that are just like your typical funding opportunities that have been around for years. So there's that kind of bucket of funding that has not been adjusted at all for trying to actually target coal impacted communities. So whatever funding problems existed with those, are still going to exist with this there. So this $300 million that's available from the EDA, is the first funding opportunity that we've seen is targeted at coal communities. I am honestly just not familiar enough with that program. Like, I'm, hoping to attend the webinar on August 5th and learning more. Like, I just don't know enough about it, about like where that money is going to go. My understanding is that it's targeted at like regional partnerships. So you would have, if your community wants to apply, you have to get, um, several partners within your community to help. So I don't know if there's community input required. I'm just not sure. I think that's gonna, no matter what, that's always gonna be a problem. Like that, there's always a risk that if there's not enough community engagement, that there are gonna be bad projects funded. And it's just something that we have to continue to grapple with. I see the comment about it being very hard to apply for EDA funding. That's very true. We have talked to the IWG folks a lot about how inaccessible federal funding is generally for disadvantaged communities, and they understand that. What changes they're making, I don't know yet. Hopefully we'll see some effort on the webinar on August 5th, that they're trying to change the processes to better serve disadvantaged communities, but I haven't seen or heard evidence of that yet. But I think it's something we're gonna have to continue to press on, is that the funding requirements, the processes, need to be adapted to better reach disadvantaged communities.
Thanks, Chelsea. I think another question in line with that that's been asked, are there ways in which either sectors or communities are coordinating around this funding?
I'm going to assume that's about just the $300 million available from EDA. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else has a better answer to that. We can take people promote people up to attendees to panelists from attendees if folks have a comment on that.
I think part of the answer is for at least Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia, those workshops that are coming up hosted by the IWG are good places for that conversation and those other regional conversations that they already have planned. I think if it's another region, I would almost, offer to say if it's Southwest Virginia, I think Appalachian Voices is interested in having those conversations and welcome partners to help us think through that. Regionally, I would plug into those technical workshops that the IWG has planned to get that synergy and communication going with partners.
Yeah, that's very true. I think their original intent was to host these workshops and physically in communities, and that would have been a lot more. It allowed for a lot more engagement across different stakeholders in that specific region to start coordinating, but having them move to virtual makes that a little bit more difficult, but I imagine that if you attend one of the virtual workshops that are regionally focused, you could ask them for contact information of the other attendees. And I think those workshops are scheduled to be like 3 hours long. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of engagement, a lot of back and forth. So I think you'll start to learn who's in the room, quote unquote room, and what kinds of projects they're thinking about. Amanda adds that regional development districts have staffers dedicated to apply for these kinds of funds. So they should be encouraged to partner with community groups to apply.
Not seeing any more questions.
I'm scrolling through the chat here to see if there's anything that I guess there was a question about where the funds are from. So I guess, just to clarify, definitely not from the Reclaim Act. The Reclaim Act has not passed Congress at this point. The only funding opportunity dedicated to coal communities right now is this EDA pot of money, $300 million, but we are expecting that there will be more opportunities in the future. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Biden administration, separate from this effort, has an initiative called the Justice 40 initiative. And that initiative is to dedicate 40% of all federal spending to environmental justice communities or disadvantaged communities. And all of these communities would qualify under the definition of disadvantaged community. So I think we'll see separate efforts to make sure that federal funding is reaching disadvantaged communities. That's a little less defined at this point in terms of like whether there will be separate funding announcements or whether it's just changes to how the funding is allocated. But one of the first programs that they're working through to try to make sure that 40% of funding goes to disadvantaged communities is ARC power money, Appalachian Regional Commission power funding, as well as the Abandoned Mineland Pilot Program through OSMRE. So I know that's very specific to Appalachian. Those two funding opportunities are specific to Appalachian communities, but we should see some efforts to try to make those programs more accessible to disadvantaged communities, and then that effort will grow to other federal agencies as well. So it's a long answer to say this initial funding is EDA funding, which is basically like funding from the COVID relief package that passed Congress early this year. And then other future funding sources, we're not sure where they'll come from, but I think they'll come from lots of different places.
We had a hand raise. I think if you raised your hand, you should be able to come off of mute.
Shauna, I just unmuted you, hopefully.
Yeah, I just thought this would be easier to say than try to type out. So like my small teeny tiny community is in East Kentucky. I think it's in the Green Range there. It might fall right outside of it. But it is specifically does not have coal jobs that have immediately left. But if I'm in that East Kentucky range, does my community still count for this funding? Does that make sense? Like we used to have all kinds of coal mining jobs and now we don't. But I'm wondering if I'm still in that East Kentucky range, do I still count?
Yeah, I think so. So with the EDA funding, they've specifically said if you can show any sort of negative economic impact from the decline of coal, then your community is eligible.
Okay. Well, I thought I heard something earlier about this wasn't older communities, it was just recent communities.
Well, this map, yeah, just this map does not really represent, I mean, in some cases it does, right? Like West Virginia,
Okay.
like even though a lot of the job losses have been, over past decades, they're still,
Okay.
we still somehow managed to get a lot of Appalachian communities in this top 25. Um, but yeah, I will rephrase that this map that was used to identify these top 25 communities does a poor job of reflecting long-term cold losses, but all the funding opportunities so far are available to any coal impacted community that has shown.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't listening
No,
closer.
it's confusing. Don't worry about it.
And also, I'm the one that asked the question about the ATV parks, and you did give me some comfort and insight. So I appreciate that.
Good.
Thanks.
Yeah. And just to reiterate, there sort of are two overlapping but distinct, and again, like connected opportunities here. The EDA funding is an opportunity from the American Rescue Plan, and then the IWG is supporting their initial efforts to prioritize supporting impacted communities by offering these technical workshops and coordinating with the EDA to make sure that co-impacted communities are really like understanding that process. And then there will be further engagement and efforts from the IWG beyond this one opportunity of funding. And the EDA funding was announced with 6 other announcement opportunities that all sort of have overlapping interests, I think, for folks. The Build Back Better Regional Challenge, a Good Jobs Challenge, Economic Adjustment Assistance, Indigenous communities, travel, tourism, outdoor recreation, state planning, research and networks, and then also the coal communities commitment. So it's worth, we'll share that so folks can see that. But again, it's really worth going to their webinar on Thursday and to be able to really dive deeper into eligibility and how to make those projects come to fruition. Okay, any final questions? Let's see. Bobby has made a comment. I hope they overlay some of the GOS layers outside the energy sector losses due to the recent coal jobs. Impacted watersheds. That's a good point. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us today, for being interested in this. Let's see, I think another hand is raised. I'm trying to figure out how to.
Kent, I think you should be able to talk
Kent,
now.
yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm Kent Minot here in Knoxville, and I work closely with the Bull Run community here. And I'm the one that put the question in about a number of coal plant closures that are coming up in Tennessee. And my question is there anything peculiar or different about communities inside the TVA service area? And particularly, I think one of the things that's coming up that's going to be very difficult is the disposal of mounds of coal ash at Bull Run, Kingston, Cumberland, and they're already moving it out of Allen over in Memphis. And this is an enormously expensive operation. And I know TVA is kind of slow walking any deliberation around it because it's ultimately billions of dollars to dispose of it correctly. There's no regulation in place statewide here in Tennessee, like what they have in Virginia and North Carolina, to excavate it and lined and capped and far away from water is where the way they have to dispose of it. Is there any conversation federally about how to deal with all this coal ash? And do TVA ratepayers ultimately have to shoulder the tremendous cost of it? I know TVA is sort of sequestered from other sources of federal funding. It's supposed to pay for everything out of ratepayer funds. Anyway, if you could help with any of those questions, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, coal ash is not my area of expertise. I don't know if there's anyone else on the line that might be able to answer that. And TVA also, it's not something I've had to deal with long. My my assumption is on why it kind of got left out of this is that there are just a lot of other types of jobs in that area of Tennessee that the percentage of current coal jobs didn't reach a significant percentage, or maybe like the geographic area that they consider is somehow split up so that it ends up diluting the number of coal jobs in the region. So I don't know why it didn't show up, but like as many folks have identified here, their methodology for identifying the top 25 coal communities was not great, and could have been better in a lot of different ways. But I do think that coal ash is, I mean, we keep hearing about this, not only from folks in Tennessee, but in other places too,
Yes.
that coal ash is going to be a really big issue that this working group needs to be paying attention to.
Thanks. And remember, my question is about coal ash, yes, but more particularly about funding and how money gets moved, federal money gets moved into the TVA service area, because TVA is a federal agency. But thank you. I appreciate your answer.
All right. Well, unless there are any other questions right now, I think we're going to close up, but you've got, let me just run over to the last slide here. You've got Robert's email address, my email address, and we're going to follow up with a lot of information, including a template flyer you can use, and some template talking points that you can use in reaching out to the IWG, and we'll include email addresses, things like that. So you'll get a nice dump of information in your inbox after this. And please feel free to reach out if you have more questions or want to collaborate on anything. All right. Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.